Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so excited to share the first interview of 2026. Rachel Lee Perez is a longtime friend of the show and is a historian, author, and fellow podcaster who recently published a book about the 1916 shark attacks along the New Jersey shore, The Real Jaws, the attacks that inspired the movies. In addition to all of her fantastic work in the podcasting space, Perez is also a member of the Remedial Herstory Project, which is dedicated to increasing the level of women's stories shared in primary and secondary classrooms in an effort to promote cultural competence and awareness of women's contributions throughout history. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, joining me today is friend and former guest of the podcast, Rachel Lee Perez. She is an independent historian, author, and podcaster. She has authored several fiction and nonfiction books, as well as contributed numerous articles to media publications covering history, news, and politics. She is the founder and host of the #History podcast, which delves into history's greatest stories of controversy, conspiracy, and corruption. I am so happy to welcome Rachel to discuss her latest book, The Real Jaws, the attacks that inspired the movies. Welcome, Rachel.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And for your listeners that don't know this, we have a long history of being history podcast buddies, but also was so supportive of my work with this book, and also contributed like a review and a quote to the book that is featured in the book that we're talking about today. So just thank you so much for all of your support all the time, all the things, and specifically related to this project.
Oh gosh, you're so very welcome. It was fun to be a part of it. I was honored to get a sneak preview of the book.
Well,
And
thank
so
you.
speaking of it, let's dive in. So
Yay.
this is such an incredible yet niche topic. So I think the first question that I have is, what inspired your research into a series of attacks along the New Jersey shoreline in the early 20th century?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. Good question. So as you know, we just chatted about it briefly. I have a podcast, the #History podcast, and kind of what we do is just talk about obscure niche topics throughout history. It's one of my favorite things is to research things that people don't know a lot about, and especially things that have a through line to today, which this book, this topic very much does. It very much influences the way that we perceive sharks to this day. And the 1916 shark attacks were one of those random topics that we covered on the podcast years ago. And it was one that just always stuck with me. It always fascinated me. It was something that I wanted to dive into further. And as I started doing the research for this book, I just became even more fascinated with it. The way that the polio epidemic and German American internment and even New York City's sanitation system all played a role in this series of shark attacks in New Jersey.
Well, as we all know, being historians, you pull out a thread and then the
Oh,
story just comes to you.
it's so dangerous. You start with one thing and then you end up with a million others.
Exactly. Well, you start actually by kind of diving into the history surrounding our fear of sharks. So, what's behind this fear?
Yeah, that's kind of where the book starts, right? Is like ancient times all the way back to the Greeks, and this fear of sharks has existed since ancient times. And it's really the fear of the unknown is what drives our fear of sharks historically. I talk about it in the book about how a shark's literal biology and behaviors are what lead it to be an elusive creature that has historically been difficult to study, right? They're lone creatures that are few and far between. They've never fared well in captivity, which means that it wasn't until the 1950s and then again in the 1970s after the release of the movie Jaws that sharks were really studied and that the funding was actually there to properly study them. So that means that for centuries, we have filled in the gaps of our knowledge with our imagination, and that has led to a lot of myths and misinformation.
Yeah. Well, and to dive into the actual kind of meat of this book, for listeners who might be unfamiliar
Mm.
with the 1916 New Jersey attacks, could you kind of describe the social and cultural atmosphere of the summer, what was happening in America that might have influenced how people responded to these events?
Well, let's see. How much time do you have? Let me tell you everything about America in 1916. We're going to be
Yes,
here a
please
very
do.
long time. 1916 was such a complex time in American history. I think that's such a great question, right? Like, why did these events escalate to the level that they did? And so much of that has to do with the cultural atmosphere of the summer of 1916. So, for one, we have a burgeoning society between the increasing accessibility of personal motor vehicles. This was huge. There was the expansion of public transportation. There was the ability for the first time in a long time for Americans to actually vacation, to have leisure time. And so, with all of these facets, people were traveling to places like New Jersey resort towns in numbers unlike ever before. And particularly in 1916, Americans had reason to want to travel and get away, right? The polio epidemic was raging in the city centers, and people were being encouraged by the government to leave the city and hit the coastal beaches where the disease wasn't spreading as rapidly. And then more globally, things are ramping up, with Europe currently engaged in World War One. At this point in history, America had not yet entered the war, and our president, the 28th President Woodrow Wilson, was actually campaigning for reelection on that very promise, right? That he was not going to get us involved in the war. And even with that promise, I mean, things were looking more and more like war was going to be inevitable, which we know it eventually proved to be true, that it was not inevitable for Americans to get involved. And so, again, Americans just had more reason to want to get away and enjoy some leisure time, unlike ever before.
Yeah. And you note that kind of in the aftermath of these attacks, the tourism industry initially tried to kind of suppress the news.
Mm.
So, what motivated this decision? And I think kind of a broader question is what does it reveal about early 20th century media ethics and that growing relationship between journalism, business, and public fear?
Yeah, this is actually one of the strongest parallels between the 1916 shark attacks and the book slash movie Jaws. For any listeners that haven't picked up on it yet or don't know, it is this series of shark attacks that inspired the book Jaws. And again, this is one of the strongest parallels that we see because in Jaws, if you'll recall, the local government, it's primarily the mayor, refuses to do anything about the first shark attack. He didn't want to alarm the resort guest. He certainly didn't want to halt any money that was coming in from that summer's beachgoers. And that was the same deal in Beach Haven, New Jersey, where the first attack occurred. After the first attack, it was hardly reported, only making its way onto the 18th page of the New York
Mm.
Times in this tiny, tiny little article. I have this picture in the book. I was able to obtain that spread of the newspaper that day, and it's just the smallest. I don't know if you've seen it. It's just the tiniest little picture, this tiny article. It doesn't even reference a shark. It says that it's a death by fish. And so it's clear that they were trying to suppress that initial attack. In fact, there wasn't even a warning sent out beyond the immediate resort about this attack, which that's pretty shocking that this was not spread to other resorts across the coast. But to your question more broadly, we do see this escalate and actually swing to the opposite side of the spectrum by the end of this killing spree, with journalists writing up totally fabricated and harmful stories.
Yeah.
I talk in the book about how we see a similar phenomenon in the summer of 2001. Time magazine actually called it the summer of the shark due
Mhm.
to what they reported was an increase in shark attacks and sightings that year. This was not true, that there was no increase in attacks that summer, but because the media was reporting on shark attacks more than they had in previous years, people read the headlines and they believe them. All of this ties back into the major role that the media and journalism plays in stoking fear in the
Yeah.
public.
And I think kind of beyond that immediate panic,
Mm.
how did the attacks kind of change coastal culture or the American relationship to the ocean in the years that followed?
0. I don't mean to say totally 0 because, of course, there's, isolated individual experiences, but this part is so wild to me in all of my research, despite the fact that these incidents were so big, they were such a large story that even the London Times was covering it in their paper. The attacks ultimately did very little to reduce the relationship that Americans had with the ocean. In fact, one of the stories that I tell in the book is about a guy that is a witness, a man that witnessed one of the attacks, and he describes it as one of the most horrifying things he's ever
Mm.
seen. And then the newspaper reports that he then goes and jogs and gets right back in the water after giving that quote. And then even, a year later in 1917, when there's another attack along the Jersey coast, it went largely unreported. So again, it's not true everywhere. There are isolated individual responses from people that never went in the ocean again. We know from Matawan, the small town, the creek where a shark came in and killed two of the townspeople there. For generations later, parents would warn their children to never go in the creek.
Mm.
But really, I would say the primary aftermath that we do see, it's not necessarily a change in human relationship with the ocean, but there was certainly a change in our relationship with sharks,
Yeah.
both following the 1916 shark attacks and then again in the 1970s after the Jaws movie came out. We see a really alarming mass shark hunt that
Yeah.
ensued. Everyone from the government to your average citizen was out in the waters killing sharks en masse. And so, while our relationship with the water didn't change by and large, it very much changed how we perceive sharks and our responses to them.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned in your previous response that there was, a couple quotes that you were delving into from people that
Mm,
that witnessed those attacks. And I think, this is such an incredibly researched book. And so I wanted to ask, were there any firsthand stories from
mm.
survivors, rescuers, so on, that really stood out to you during your research that, accounts that really kind of shaped your understanding of how
Yeah.
people process this?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it's my favorite part about studying history is putting ourselves in the shoes of these people, and realizing, these are real life people that existed that have the same thoughts and feelings and emotions as you or I. And the one that comes to me right away when you ask that, it's a poem that was written by the sister of one of the victims. Stanley Fisher was the last person that was killed during this 2-week spree. And from everything that I've read about him, he was just this phenomenal guy. I actually spoke to his biographer in Matawan while I was researching my book. And his biographer said that that was actually a struggle that he found as he was putting together his book about
Mm.
Fisher, that he just could not find anything bad about this guy. And his character really shows through into his final moments. He was killed by the shark while he was attempting to rescue another. And so his family was just absolutely distraught over his passing. And this one really resonated with me. His sister, who was pregnant at the time of his passing, I know that because we're personal friends as well. My sister passed while I was pregnant. And reading her account just really hit me. And
Mhm.
understanding her pain of family not being there, that you expect to be there at the birth of your kids. And she wrote this poem. It's published 2 years after his passing, and that was something also that, I'm assuming the position she was in history. I don't know this for a fact, but just having been through my own grief journey, understanding why it may have taken her 2 years to write
Yeah.
this poem and get it published really resonated with me. And I actually wrote it down here because I was hoping to share it. It's short,
Of course, yeah.
but it just puts everything into perspective that these were like real people that lost their families in really horrifically tragic and unexpected ways. So her poem, it says, "It was hard to part with him, the one we love so dear. The heart no greater pain could feel, no sorrow more severe. What pain he bore we will never know. We did not see him die. We only know that he is gone and never said goodbye."
Oh.
And it's just like so tragic, so harrowing, and really puts all this into perspective, right? We and I certainly play into this in the book, right? Is this like horror, mystery experience, but it's also really, really tragic. These people lost their loved ones while they were on vacation or doing really heroic things like saving a little boy from the creek.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate about this book that there was a lot of humanity in this
Mm,
in this narrative, right? Like you're telling these events, but you're also, and you do this very well, I think, even in the podcast as well, and all of the other pieces that I've read of yours is you always stay focused on the human story, so it came through so eloquently. So
thank you.
thank you
I'm
for
happy to
sharing that.
hear that because
Yeah,
that's I think that that's why people are not interested in history, right? Unless you're a
yeah,
history nerd like you or I, is that they think it's all dates and facts and times and
right.
places. It's human stories.
Hmm.
It's people just like you and me having the exact same experiences that we have. And that's why I find it so fascinating and why I'm so compelled to make history engaging and entertaining for other people as well.
Yes, preach, preach. I love it.
I know. I mean, would you just look at where we're at right now, our current political, cultural climate? We're
Yes.
repeating ourselves for generations and generations. It's all the same thing. We have not evolved or changed one bit.
Rachel for president.
Mm, never. No, thank you. I remove my name.
So you write about how there is the line between fact and fiction really gets blurred. So, what are
Hmm.
some of the most persistent myths that emerged in the press coverage, and how did they distort our public understanding of sharks?
Yeah. So a lot of it does come from the media, right? But initially, those myths were intended to massively downplay sharks and their capabilities. And I think it's so important to note here that, like, before I can dive into the press's impact, that so much of that misinformation was coming from world renowned shark experts themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Even those who had spent their lives researching marine animals did not have a good understanding of sharks and their behaviors and their capabilities in April of 1916. So, this is just a few months before the attacks took place. Three of the world renowned experts wrote in a scientific journal that sharks had no interest in humans. And even if by chance they did come upon a human and just happened to bite the human, that their jaws weren't even strong enough to sever bone. It's wild, right, with our hindsight and our understanding of sharks now, but they genuinely didn't believe this. And so much of what the press was perpetuating at the time was information given to them from the experts. Even as the attacks were taking place, these experts continued to backtrack for some time, trying to place the blame on other marine animals like dolphins or sea turtles or whales. And so that's what the media took and ran with. The media played a really large role in these myths. Like I shared earlier, initially they're kind of suppressing the accidents and then it ends up flipping and they end up reporting some pretty egregious myths. One being that the body of Lester Stillwell, the 11-year-old boy that Stanley Fisher was saving from the Matawan Creek, um, they reported that his body had been found in the belly of a shark, which was not true and
Mm,
caused the family even more heartache as they were
mm.
searching for his body. These myths continue into modern times, right? Like I shared earlier, the summer of the shark in 2001 was a similar phenomenon in which the media distorted the truth.
Yeah. Well, and so when do we kind of see this shift, right? We go
Mm,
from kind of downplaying, they really aren't capable of doing this, to this kind of being of malevolence and an intentional killer, like really just hunting people down.
mhm.
So when did that kind of take hold in the American imagination?
Yeah, it interestingly, it's gradual, and it culminates in the release of the movie Jaws in 1975. And the reason for that is although the 1916 shark attacks were a big deal when they happened, they do start to disappear in the
Mm,
midst of so many larger events going on in American history at the time. And in the following years, right? We have the epidemic, we have the World War, the women's suffrage movement, the roaring 20s, and so on and so forth. Jaws, however, genuinely changed history. I write in the book how monumental the movie was. It
yeah.
broke the record of over 100 million at the box office in just 2 months. It eventually earned over 470 million worldwide, making it the highest grossing film of all time. It continues to rank in the top 10 best films ever made. It became the first summer blockbuster and really set the standard for the way that summer movies are marketed and distributed to this day. This was so fascinating to me as I was doing my research that prior to Jaws, the summer months had kind of been relegated as like, that's your dud movies. Just like, no one's watching movies in the summer. We'll throw our bad movies during the summertime and wait for a big release in the fall. Jaws changed that. Like the
Yeah.
reason we have these big summer blockbusters are now because of Jaws. And the vast majority of people that I know have seen Jaws, but even if you haven't seen it, like everyone has heard of
Yes.
Jaws, right? Like I don't know anyone that hasn't heard of Jaws, but the same cannot be said of the 1916 shark attacks. And
Yeah.
so obviously, Jaws had a larger impact on the narrative surrounding sharks being these intentional killers. That's derived from 1916. But again, we start to kind of lose some of the more salacious pieces of 1916 as the years carry on. I think I mentioned this in the book, and I jotted it down here because I really wanted to talk about it with you. How big Jaws was resulted in it getting its own term. Like a University of Sydney professor, Christopher Neff, he coined the term the Jaws effect. It's a
Mm,
term that he used to describe precisely how the movie changed and influenced the perception that people have of sharks to this day. And this effect has three tenets. One, the belief that sharks intentionally bite humans. Two, that human shark encounters are always fatal. And
mm,
three, that sharks should be killed to prevent future attacks. That really summarizes the distortion that these attacks, the 1916 attacks and then eventually, particularly Jaws, has
yeah.
played in reshaping how we perceive sharks.
Yeah. Well, and talking about perception, I think the other thing I'm curious for your take on is, we have the 1916 attacks, then we have
Mhm.
this huge summer blockbuster, as you're talking about,
Mhm.
kind of inaugurates the term summer blockbuster.
Mhm.
I know why Jaws resonates with me. It's one of my favorite movies. I always tell my husband, we know it's summer because I'm starting to watch Jaws.
I love that.
So, what do you think the movie, what do you think why Jaws resonated so much with so many people?
Yep. I love this question because I think you hit it right on the nose that people were primed to
Mhm,
fear sharks, but maybe without full clarity as to why. And Jaws once again filled in those gaps. It
mhm,
made these elusive, mysterious creatures that had historically been shrouded in fear into real life human eating machines. The groundwork was already there, but Peter Benchley, the author of the book
mhm.
Jaws, and then Steven Spielberg, the director of the movie, are what catered to that fear that was already lying dormant.
Yeah. It's an incredible movie, folks.
It is.
If you can look at it from, 50 years past,
I had a feeling, even though you and I haven't chatted about this, because I know you're a big movie buff, I had a feeling that you had an affinity for Jaws. I could already tell.
Oh, yes, definitely.
I mean, if you love movies, you love Jaws.
Yes.
It stands the test of time. It is an incredible movie.
Yes, I agree. Well, and speaking of Peter Benchley, he is the author, as you mentioned, of the book that
Mhm.
inspired the movie.
Mhm.
So, how did Benchley influence America's perception of sharks, and how has that evolved? Because even
Yeah.
his perception has kind of shifted over the years.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I love to talk about this kind of the evolution of Peter Benchley, right? And his perception of sharks. The answer of how his book shaped perception, I think, kind of goes hand in hand with the movie.
Yeah.
His book was a massive success, similar to the movie. It was an immediate bestseller. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 44 weeks. But even as successful as his book was, nothing is as pervasive as the film, right? That he directly contributed to. And he really did himself evolve over time. When he wrote the book, he had no idea the massive impact that it was going to have and the way that it would quite literally change human perception of sharks. He later acknowledged this misinformation and dedicated a large chunk of his life to shark education and conservation efforts. He actually was quoted as saying, if he were to rewrite the book all over again, that he would portray the humans and not the sharks as the villains, because he
Mm.
saw how pervasive the misinformation was in his book and the subsequent movie, and the way that people respond to that with mass killing and other shark prevention efforts.
Yeah. Well, and that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, we've touched on this a little bit in our conversation, and you write about how humans
Mhm.
have kind of become the predators and
Yeah.
sharks really the prey. So, can you kind of elaborate on how cultural fear threatened or translated, excuse me, into real life ecological harm?
It's pretty devastating, the real
Yeah.
world impacts that Jaws had on sharks. Several countries, primarily Australia and South Africa, have adopted what they call shark culling programs. They're oftentimes inhumane practices that lead to the capture and murder of hundreds, sometimes thousands of sharks every single year. Several of these beaches have shark nets that are set up. In Australia, it's several of their beaches have the nets through the months of September through April. In some of the beaches across Queensland, the nets just stay up all year long. And what these nets are, right, they are intended to capture sharks before they may reach bathers, but they're these huge, large nets that are placed in a body full of marine life. And so what inevitably happens is that you also capture and kill other species that are not on their quote unquote target list. The Humane Society International actually found that more than half of the marine animals captured in these nets, animals like dolphins, turtles, whales, and other non threatening sharks, are killed as a result. A lot of these countries also implement something called drum lines. I don't know if you've seen them. They're awful. They are these baited hooks that are attached to a buoy as well as an anchor, which leads to sharks who take the bait actually ending up with a hook pierced through their skull. Even more devastating is that these drum lines are not even placed near the shore, right? They would be dangerous to humans. They're not placed
Right.
near the shore where humans are generally swimming. So then their use feels even more unnecessary and heinous if they're not even placed where humans are bathing. To kind of summarize, there is, of course, a need for safety. If
Yeah.
humans are going to be engaging with the ocean, we do need to be safe and practical. But with today's technology, there's so many other ways to go about it, much more humane ways. There's drones, alarm systems, tagging and tracking systems,
Yeah.
education, and all of that. That's always going to be the most safe, effective, and really the best route when we're
Yeah.
approaching safety from
Yeah.
sharks.
And reducing the harm across the board.
And reducing the harm, it's really, really tragic and really inhumane.
Yeah, I will say, I know some people watched Jaws and had an intense fear of sharks. I
Yeah,
think that movie
fair.
really helped me just become fascinated with them. And so I
Mhm.
remember Discovery Shark Week, and before it became a little, I think, a little crazy and commercialized.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is something I mentioned in the book. I don't remember the stat right here off the top of my head, but as much as I'm talking about what a negative impact Jaws had, it also had a really positive one directly to what you just said, that so many people became fascinated with sharks and watching Shark Week. And again, I don't remember the exact stat, but there's a percentage of people that, had they not watched Jaws would have never been fascinated in sharks
Yep.
and learning about sharks. And so many people that do watch Shark Week care very much about conservation efforts.
Yes.
It's not
Yes.
all bad. It's actually many times there's a much more positive response than negative nowadays.
Yeah. I'm happy to be a part of that statistic.
I love it. Yep.
Well, and one of the things you do in the podcast, and I think one of the things that comes through in this book is kind of connecting the past to the present. And
Mm.
so, how can understanding this century-old event kind of help us reimagine our relationship with the ocean and its creatures today?
Yeah. I mean, these events were shocking because they were unprecedented. They highlighted how little humans knew about sharks and their capabilities up to this point. And now that we know more about sharks, we can see the ways in which human activity influences animal behavior. What these events also demonstrate was the large role that the media plays in projecting sometimes a single narrative. But hopefully, the overwhelming message that we take away from the 1916 shark attacks and subsequently Jaws is shifting us away from the concept of fear and certainly of domination, and hopefully shifting us more towards respect and coexisting.
Yeah. And there's so much that's covered in this book, but I want to ask you, what do you hope readers ultimately take away from The Real Jaws?
The main thing that I want readers to take away from this book is that the ocean is the shark's home and not
Mm,
ours. I make a note in the book to avoid using the phrase shark infested waters. I hate that phrase because there's no such thing. There's
yeah.
no such thing as an ocean that is infested with sharks. It is quite literally their home. And so it's our responsibility as humans to respect that and to use our caution and educate ourselves about the best ways to avoid a shark attack, all of which is in my book. And I have a whole section in the book about the dangers of sharks going extinct, right? Like the marine ecosystem quite literally depends on the existence of sharks. Our very way of life
Yeah.
continuing to exist as is, it doesn't exist as is without the presence of sharks. And so my hope, the number one takeaway from this book is that while sharks are these, they are dangerous to humans, right? But they're also beautiful and
Mhm.
magnificent. And the ocean is their home, not ours. And we need to learn how to respect and coexist with them as opposed to dominate them, whether that be through force or even just through perception and fear.
Definitely. Well, and as kind of hinted at in my introduction, you are a busy, busy, busy woman. We haven't even scratched the surface of all of the things that you have
Yeah, it's
going on
true.
at the moment. But I do want to give you an opportunity. Where should people go when they've finished your book and they want to learn more about you and the work that you do?
Thank you for that. I would love if you all would check out the podcast. It's hashtag history. We're on Instagram at hashtag history_podcast. Our website is hashtag history-pod.com. That's where we put out bi-weekly episodes about niche, obscure topics all throughout history. That is really a major passion project of mine. I love the podcast. I would love if you would jump over and check me out there. And then if you're interested in more of my work, more of my writing, the best place to go is my website. It's rachelleeperez.com, or I'm on Instagram at rachelleeperez_author. Those are good places to check out upcoming projects that I have, political articles I'm writing where I'm screaming about our current administration, things like that. But also, I don't mind sharing, since I am in the presence of a bunch of history nerds on this podcast, I'm sure that my next two projects are a small book about Dorothea Puente. She was a female
Mm,
serial killer here in Sacramento. Her house still
nice.
stands because it's part of the historic registry here in Sacramento and can't be bulldozed, which is so crazy because she was burying people in her backyard, and
Jesus.
that still stands. It's close to. This is so crazy. Let's just derail this whole conversation about talk about Dorothea Puente. Anyway, that's one of my upcoming projects, and then I am also currently writing a book about the Salem witch trials.
Ah, I
Yeah.
saw the Instagram preview and I was like, I think I know what that is.
Uh-huh. Oh my gosh, let me tell you, it is a little stressful. There's just so much as opposed to, as opposed to the 1960 shark attacks, I am finding complete opposite challenges. Whereas I was writing the 1916 shark attacks, it was difficult to
Yeah.
get information. There isn't that much outside of, a few newspaper articles and some personal accounts. The Salem witch trials, I'm like, am I in over my head here? There's just so much.
Well, I
Why did
can't
they have
wait.
to record everything? Every examination, every court hearing, everyone was written down in awful English that's very hard to understand.
You'll be able to navigate it. I have
Yeah, I'm
all the
working
faith.
on it.
Okay, well, we've kind of covered a lot of ground here, but, simultaneously have only kind of scratched the surface. So is
Yeah.
there anything we haven't talked about that you want future readers to know?
There is one thing I realized that throughout the course of us talking, I hadn't actually even addressed like the stats related to the likelihood of a shark attack. I think that that's really important as we are um, pushing back against these major pieces of misinformation that persist. So I just wanted to share with your listeners, the chances of being attacked by a shark are 1 in 11.5 million. And the chances of being killed by a shark are less than 1 in 264.1 million. You're more likely to be killed by a coconut falling out of a tree and hitting your head than by an attack by a shark. So I just wanted to share that really quickly, that I, of course, still think it's very wise to have a healthy respect of sharks and their capabilities and to not engage in any activity that would provoke them. But I think along with that healthy respect should come some healthy perspective about how unlikely it actually is to be attacked by a shark in the first place. I just wanted to make sure I shared that with everyone.
Yes.
With a book called The Real Jaws and a very scary great white shark on the cover of it, I do want to lay some perspective that it is very unlikely, the probability of being attacked by a shark.
Wonderful. And
Yeah.
a great way to end this conversation. To the listeners out there, I highly, highly recommend picking up a copy of The Real Jaws. It's fast-paced, it's incredibly researched, and it gives you a niche history that you might not otherwise be aware of, that influenced generations and still influences generations, I'd argue. If you have any interest in sharks or pop culture, I cannot recommend the book enough. Also, please check out #history. It's one of the podcasts in my normal rotation. I absolutely enjoy Rachel and Leah's deep dives into all the conspiracy, controversy, and corruption in United States history. So thank you again so much, Rachel, for coming on and chatting about your book.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
My thanks again to Rachel for sharing her time with me. And for the listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of The Real Jaws so you can learn all about the attacks that fateful summer along the eastern seaboard and how they influenced generations to come. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.